So if the East will eclipse the West, is it inevitable that China and India will become more powerful than Europe and the United States? My next guest says that if you take the long view, the West's rise is actually the anomaly, a blip in history. Ian Morris wrote the best-selling Why the West Rules for Now. And he has a new book out, a continuation essentially, called The Measure of Civilization. Morris is a professor at Stanford University, but we managed to drag him to New York. Welcome.
Well, thanks for having me here.
So, what do you mean by a blip? Do you mean that that for most of the time of the previous history, the East was dominant just because these were large, vast countries? Agriculture was the basis of most economic productivity, but their governments didn't do anything with it. They didn't mobilize that wealth in any way.
Yes, well, through most of history, you get powers and civilizations that are dominant in just one part of the world. That if you go back all the way to the end of the Ice Age, 15,000 years ago, the most developed part of the world has usually, in fact, been at the western end of Eurasia, around the Mediterranean Sea. But there was a great limit on how far they could project the power. And it's not really until you get to the Industrial Revolution that all of a sudden these nations, mostly around the shores of the Atlantic, can suddenly project their power anywhere in the world. So about 200 years ago, the West quite abruptly starts to dominate the whole planet.
Why does America rise?
Well, I think this is a continuation of the same kind of processes. That through most of history, of course, the Americas completely separate from the rest of the world. They're doing their own thing, they're developing in their own ways. Then they start getting drawn into an economy based on Europe, starting in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And initially, it's all driven from Europe, by the European capitals and the people coming out from Europe. By the time you get into the 19th century, though, and you're able to start building railroads, and the telegraph comes in, distance is shrinking, and increasingly as this happens, the Americans are able to move from being a kind of a periphery to a European global system, to being the center of a global system themselves. And it's all about the shrinking of space. The geography is driving this story, but what the geography means keeps changing.
So if you look at China, most importantly, in India, to a lesser extent, rising, at the very time that you are having this dramatic shrinking of space,
yes.
Does it matter as much? You know, will it have the same kind of impact that the rise of the West had?
Yeah, I think it will. I think again we've got this long story here where we're seeing similar kinds of processes unfolding in different parts of the world. So first of all, you get the Atlantic Ocean shrinking from about 1400 on. This pushes the Western Europe up to the top of the pile. Atlantic Ocean shrinks more. North America kind of shrinks too in the 19th century. This pushes North America up to the top of the pile. And then the 20th century, of course, we've seen the shrinking of the Pacific Ocean, which is so big that right up till the late 19th century, it's just very difficult for people to exploit the Pacific effectively.
Even now, I'm always struck by when you travel to Asia, you take those flights and you suddenly realize, my God, the Pacific is a long, long ocean.
Yeah, and I think, it's really illuminating just to look at a globe. You know, you turn a globe and you face the Atlantic and you see the continents on either side. Turn the globe around to look at the Pacific and it basically fills the entire field of vision, just a huge thing. But as the 20th century went on, of course, the technology shrink, this containerization comes in, the internet, jet airliners. And I think what we're seeing now with East Asia, and particularly China, is that like the United States 200-ish years ago, they're now being drawn into a global economy. And for quite a while, they were a periphery, some still are really, a periphery to an American-dominated global system. But the big trend is pushing towards them rising to the top of this global system.
And do they have experience that there are two views. One is, look, China was always a backwater. There was the Middle Kingdom, fine, they dominated their own little part of Asia, but they had no real interaction with the world. They stopped building big boats partly because they got less interested in all that.
Yes.
And so they actually have no experience with this. It's going to be a very new thing. And then there are those who say, no, this is a 5,000-year civilization.
Yes. I think you can look at the history, and I can see how people can draw both of these conclusions. But what strikes me most, looking at long-term Chinese history, is that China has always been just as interested in the rest of the world as every other major power. A lot of the time, though, they would get in a situation where there just wasn't much attraction for them to be sending out voyages to the other end of the world, or people across Central Asia to reach to India and Iran and to Europe. But whenever it has been attractive, whenever there's been something to gain, they've not hesitated to do so. And people will sometimes say, we're going to see a very different world order with China at the center, where new kinds of diplomacy will come to the fore and people won't be using force as much to achieve national goals. But again, if you look back over Chinese history, they've been as aggressive as anybody else in pursuing their own interests whenever the use of force seemed like a good way to get those interests. So my guess would be that a world system dominated by China would not be so very different in the way it runs from the kind of world we're used to today.
Ian Morris, pleasure to have you on.
Well, thanks very much for having me here.